So I am going to get started here with the lecture, and in 2017 into 18, I did a study with Diana of the University of South Carolina, and also Laura and Ray and some students on it was a qualitative study on the social and emotional well-being of women who sleep with women. And that study was done by conducting 6 focus groups with 37 women. They ranged in ages from 20 to 64. All participants identified as women either seeking or have sought relationships with women. And one second. Yeah. So a large portion of those people actually came from the state of Ohio. Okay. Whoa. All right. Hey, Trish, can you mute your screen? Because I think everybody else can hear you there. All right, there we go. All right, so a large portion of those women actually came from Ohio, 32%. 27% came from South Carolina, 27% from Georgia. 14% of those women came from other states. So 64% of those women actually participated with friends during the focus groups, and 20% actually participated with their significant other. And most of the participants of the study had been out to immediate family for 11 years. So, and 54% of them were actually in current relationships, averaging less than 2 years. So as a result of that study, we actually came up with, we did some coding and data, and we came up with 18 sub-themes. So that's a lot. But we were able to actually take those 18 sub-themes and condense them down to 4 core themes. And those 4 core themes were actually shame and fear, community, gender roles and norms, and normalcy. And as you might have seen, the topic today is actually on shame and fear. That's Norman, not me. So, so one of the first, when looking at shame and fear, we noticed that there were 4 components that kept popping up. That first component, let me just write down right here. My handwriting isn't the best, but that first component was called compartmentalization. So compartmentalization, in this sense, in the women who sleep with women lesbian sense, it means so they might be out at home but not out at work but not out at church, maybe out at chess club but not out at knitting club. So they compartmentalize part of their lives. And some people may have done this before. Anybody ever do pieces of that? I mean, and it doesn't have to mean, it may be, for example, I had a friend that was in the sales and marketing department for her job. And part of the job was to attend a lot of happy hours and schmooze dinners. And so she compartmentalized. She had a partner, but it helped to make the image that she was single in order to advance in that industry. So compartmentalizing. So you might see that in different parts of your life, not just if you're identifying obviously as someone of the LGBT population. So compartmentalizing, and I can speak to this a little bit more because of the nature of where I came from. So I came from Johnstown, Pennsylvania. mostly known for the Johnstown floods. And it was a very masculine town, very focused on sports and football. I went to a Catholic prep school. I wore a skirt. I went to church every Friday. So it was very immersed in a culture of religion and what we consider the norm. Um, and so I compartmentalized a lot of my life, probably up until I was my early 30s. I had two closets. I had a closet over here that was women's clothes, and a closet over here that was masculine clothes. Um, and so when we say that, it was because, when I would be in college, I could easily be myself. I could, um, dress masculine. I found other people that were a part of my community that I could belong in. But when I was returning home to that, yes, I did wear a skirt. So when I was returning home, I would have to pack more feminine clothes when I would hang out with people from my Catholic school or my Catholic community. So conforming and compartmentalized pieces of my life. So that was kind of one of the core themes that we saw under shame and fear. Uh, Hello, Falami. Yes, compartmentalizing. Uh, so I wanted to share a quote from the study that speaks to this compartmentalizing, which is one of the first component that we're talking about. So the person says, there are places I differentiate in my life, and work is probably one of them. Being retired, I don't have any exposure to that right now, but I'm cognizant of that in my life. We have to think about it. And that participant was 66 years old. So for 66 years or less, that person's been thinking about where they are and who they can be. Okay? So that shame and fear that goes with that. So that's compartmentalization. The second one that we saw a lot of was avoidance. Can everyone see this on the board? Because if not, I have my bingo daubers that write a lot bigger. You got to be adaptive in these times. So the second one was actually avoidance that we saw. So avoidance. So this kind of reminds me of don't ask, don't tell. So we avoid telling altogether about our identity. I think of this as when I was in college and I wasn't out to my family or my parents. I actually would degay my apartment or house. So they would come to visit and I'd be like taking down the rainbow stuff, taking down pictures of me and my girlfriend because I wanted to avoid altogether of them knowing. So it's really avoiding altogether your true self. And I want to read a participant quote from there. So this person says, I still introduce my girlfriend as my roommate to my second graders. They know her. She sent me flowers last week, and it was my roommate, Sarah. This is just a hypothetical. Sarah sent me flowers. So they all know that she's my roommate. I'm still not comfortable enough to say that here. I mean, I feel like I wouldn't be up north either, but it's just touchy with the little kids because there's more than just little kids involved. There are parents, administrators. There's a whole other realm to it. And that person was 27 years old. So that's what we talk about when we talk about avoidance. Okay. Mike, a participant, says in his world, and Mike identifies as gay, they call that straightening up. So conforming to the norm. Thanks for sharing that, Mike. So, and C. So the third component of the shame and fear that we saw if asked, I'll tell. So this specifically, it kind of seems to me like the opposite of don't ask, don't tell. So they're not freely open, but won't hide it if asked. So a quick example I have from one of my friends, she had come out to a few people, or to her mother a few times, and her mother always kind of just ignored it. So they never really talked about it. Well, she would return home from college, and like all college kids, she would bring her dirty laundry home for her parents to do, and her mom would do her laundry, and while doing her laundry, she noticed that there were a pair of boy shorts in there. And so her mom got all excited and had asked her, "Hey, whose shorts are these?" Thinking, she has a boyfriend. Well, they're my shorts. So if she was asked about it, she would share that information, but they didn't talk about it in any other conversation. So one of the examples of the participants' quotes that I wanted to share are, there are certain people that have probably never seen us hold hands or kiss or anything, but if they asked about it, we would be like, yep, we're together, So it's not like we put it out there. And that person was 27 years old. So that was the third component of shame and fear that we saw. And the fourth component was they just know. So when we talk about they just know, we let them assume via dress, interactions, haircuts, maybe sports we play or things we like. So we let them assume. I think of an example that someone had shared with me in this study was she worked, and it was at a new job, and she had a picture of her and her brother on her desk, and everybody just assumed it was her boyfriend, and she never corrected them. They assumed that it was her boyfriend, and in order to fit in and belong, she just let them assume. So one of the quotes I want to share with you from the study is, I've never looked at my mom and dad and said, I'm gay. Never had to do it. It was just one of those things that kind of happened. I was with someone and it was just assumed. And to this day, it's the same way. They know it, but it's never talked about. It's never discussed. Now, mom will say, is your friend coming? And that person was 37 years old. So, in my study, we learned about shame and fear. We learned about the four components, which we have up here, that were most present in shame. So when I think about shame and fear recently, I think about Brene Brown. How many people have heard of Brene Brown? She's pretty popular these days. She is a researcher that looks at being your authentic self, shame and fear, belonging. And so we're going to just speak a little bit about what she believes and what she believes can make you an authentic person. And really it stems from shame and fear. And so anybody have heard of Brene Brown? She has her book, Daring Greatly. Let me check on the Zoom peeps here. Yeah, she just started a new podcast. Yeah, so Shame Shields. Yeah. So she just started a new podcast. She's got a book, Daring Greatly. She's got the Power of Vulnerability podcast. She's got a bunch of different TED Talks. So she's actually pretty popular when it comes to shame and fear. And so right now we're gonna just highlight some important points that she makes. Love her. I like her too. I like her too. So she says we as humans we're created to and neurobiologically reinforced to be rewarded and punished to connect with others. So we have a lot of feel good hormones that come about when we fall in love, uh, when we belong. But we also have a lot of yucky feelings that we feel whenever we argue or feel guilty or our behavior or we disappoint someone or when we lose connection with a loved one. She also says we're built with an unavoidable urge to connect with others and to be loved by others and to belong. Um, she says wherever there's issues of feeling disconnected, there's a lot of great suffering. Um, and she says that regularly fight voices of shame triggering in our thought processes that tell us that we're unworthy of love and belonging, and we're fearful of disconnection from others. Therefore, because we're fearful of that disconnection, we tend to hide parts of ourselves, things that we're ashamed of, in hopes to keep that connection. We become afraid of making ourselves vulnerable or fully exposed to others so that we don't feel abandoned or unloved. If they were to stop loving us, wanting to be our friends or reject us in some way. She states that shame is the voice telling us that we're unworthy, that we're unworthy of love and belonging. Um, and she says fear and shame of being unworthy or unloved stop us from living authentically and experiencing true joy and contentment in life. So what she is saying is when we have shame and fear, they stop us from being authentic. So she says that those that are not living authentic lives are often empty inside. And when you're empty inside, she states that you seek intensity. And what she means by intensity is outside themselves. They seek something outside themselves in order to feel alive. So, for example, drugs, overspending, overeating, over focusing on looking good or becoming successful. She is saying when we have shame and fear, they stop us from being authentic. So it's great what she's saying. I love what she says. I believe what she says. But Brene Brown is also mostly a social researcher. She hasn't published a lot of her work academically, so a lot of people give some of her work some criticism. And so I thought I would share what some others said that are more academic. So a study by Menard and Brene report positive correlations between authenticity and psychological well-being. In a study by Sheldon and Ryan, they're saying levels of authenticity experience across different roles were explored. And what happened was results indicated lower levels of authenticity resulted in higher levels of anxiety, depression, and perceived stress. So lower levels of authenticity, higher stress, anxiety, depression. So what Brene Brown is saying is true because it's even backed up. Another study by Wood and Lindley reported positive relations between higher levels of authenticity on one hand and satisfaction with life, positive affect, self-esteem, autonomy, gratitude, happiness, personal growth on the other hand. So the correlation of what Brene is saying is also being echoed by many other researchers. I'm just going to take this down real quick. So what Brene Brown says, how to fix shame and fear. Yes. So Falami says, and it doesn't help those of us who were indoctrinated in churches with shame and fear. Absolutely. Great point. Thanks for sharing. So Brene Brown says to fix shame and fear with vulnerability, you need to live a more authentic life. So she says to live a more authentic life, we need to be vulnerable. So being vulnerable to others can open us up to pain and hurt. So like when people leave us or betray us, when we fail at something, we tend to avoid making ourselves vulnerable. Um, um, Flami says the gay flag swinging in the background. She likes it. I didn't pose that here just for today. It just happens to be there. So what Brene Brown says is being vulnerable to others can open us up to pain and hurt. So we kind of avoid that. We don't like to feel vulnerable because it's sometimes we view it as a form of weakness, a lack of control. But what Brene Brown says, vulnerability is also the birthplace of the greatest forms of love. It's the birthplace of creativity and of fulfilling experiences in life, like loving someone, raising children, accomplishing something that was challenging. None of those things can be accomplished without a willingness to make yourself vulnerable. So we might not want to make ourselves vulnerable because we fear that rejection of others. So what she says is we only present what we feel others want to see versus showing our authentic self. So this is where those 4 components that we talked about earlier come in. So we present ourselves. We only show pieces of ourselves because we're afraid. We're afraid of being our true self. And so we fear that rejection, so we want to blend in. So she says, hey, we fix shame and fear with vulnerability. So we're gonna talk about that. So when you fix shame and fear with vulnerability, but can we fix shame and fear with vulnerability? So I want to share with you a quote, and I'm going to share my lens. Obviously, I identify as lesbian, WSW, and I'm going to speak to that lens because it's the one I obviously know the best. But some of these concepts can be used in many different lenses, especially persons who don't fit in with the norm, whether it's mental health issues, persons of color, recovering addicts, ex-offenders. So I'm going to attempt here to explain this a little more. So I want to share a quote with you, and it's by Chad Griffin of the HRC. I'm going to attempt to draw the state of Maine, which I think kind of looks like a hand. It kind of reminds me of Michigan in a way, but Italy. And, it's the furthest north you can kind of get. So here's the state of Maine. Right? Up there, it's cold. It's pretty. I've been to Acadia National Park. Beautiful. So, and here's the state of California. Kind of looks like I don't know. Like a sock. Like a wrinkly sock, right? I think so, right? So we have California. And we have Maine. Complete opposite parts of the country. Farthest northeast you can get and farthest west you can get. So Chad Griffin states that if an LGBTQ couple drove from Maine to California today, their legal rights and civil rights protections could change more than 20 times at state borders and city lines. So 20 times. 20. So, for example, and these are just a few examples, obviously I can't list them all. Mississippi passed a law titled Protecting Freedom of Conscience from Government Discrimination Act. What this law does is it allows employees and private businesses to deny services to LGBTQ individuals based on religious objections. Texas, House Bill 3859, allows faith-based groups working with Texas child welfare system to deny services under circumstances that conflict with a provider's sincerely held religious beliefs. North Carolina's Democratic Governor Ray Cooper started the HB2, which is a bill that probably most of you have heard of because it was pretty widely controversial many years ago. He instead took HB2 and turned it into HB 142, but it still kept in it the most discriminatory provisions in the original bill. And what that does is it gives control of bathroom regulation to the state's General Assembly, prohibiting cities, government agencies, or universities from crafting transgender inclusive bathroom policy. Okay, so again, we revisit what Brene Brown says. She says, hey, we want to live a more authentic life. That's easy. We need to stop being ashamed and afraid. And we're vulnerable. Hey, maybe somebody will reject us. Maybe, we might be uncomfortable. Maybe we might feel a loss of control. So I'm going to pick apart that a little bit. So I wish being vulnerable and courageous and uncomfortable was easy in these contexts. But what happens when the risk is too heavy? Okay, so we have authenticity up here. We have shame and fear down here. Okay. So what happens when the risk is too heavy? So Brene Brown says, be vulnerable. So I call this the weight of vulnerability. Can everyone see that? Can you see that? Let's see, make sure that you guys. Oh, well, I didn't even realize that you guys couldn't see the video. I can't believe it. You couldn't see the video. My apologies. All right. See, I was just in the zone and you guys couldn't see it. So anyways, Brene Brown says the weight of vulnerability. So up here, she says, in order to reach authenticity, you need to address shame and fear. How do you address shame and fear? You do it through vulnerability. I call this the weight of vulnerability. So it seems pretty easy when it comes to shame and fear to do that. But in the LGBT population, what if... Oh man, did you see that? It's a really pretty bird and he just hit my window. And now I'm gonna have to go help him. Okay, so hopefully he flies away. Okay, so the weight of vulnerability. So with the LGBT population, this is a heavy weight. This is the loss of services, of medical services. This is the loss of family, the loss of job, the loss of rights. Because like we said, when Chad Griffin highlighted, it is 20 times our legal protections and rights changed going from Maine to California. So, shame and fear. What happens when that risk is too heavy? The weight of vulnerability is too heavy. And this is what we look at. And this could be for other people as well. When we think about persons of color, and we think about, a person of color raising a young black male, the risk of just being black as a young black male. Is that worth reaching authenticity? Is it worth losing the right to adopt or health services, or losing your job for those that might work in a Catholic school system? Is it worth being vulnerable to reach authenticity? And so that is some of the stuff that we're talking about today. Specifically, let me see here. So when the risk is not just fear of rejection from others or fear of not being accepted, like Brene Brown says, or belonging, but fear of losing dreams, of losing family, of adopting children, or losing services that you might need, mental health, or jobs, what do we do? What do we do? So that's where, further research needs to develop. But I'm proposing two different concepts in theory today. Okay, so one of them is broken windows theory, which is a criminological theory that states that visible signs of crime, antisocial behavior, and civil disorder create further crime. So you might see in petty crime to bigger crime. So everything from vandalizing, graffiti, can lead to murder or assault. And so it's a theory of fixing the small things that eventually will lead to the bigger things. So I think of, if we applied this in trying to address shame and fear in order to create a more authentic lifestyle or more authentic workplaces, we would do things such as changing our language. So how many people might use "that's so gay"? I mean, how many people use that? I have even used it, which you're pretty much saying, you're trying to reference "that's weird, that's gay." And it's a negative stereotype. So maybe it's in the small things, like changing our language, like doing local ordinances, like we've been seeing going on in local cities, like banning conversion therapy or banning the box for ex-offenders. We used to be able to discriminate for jobs based off of ex-offenders, and some places I think it's still applicable, where you check the box if you have a criminal record, and that way you're discriminated against. So we start with the small, and it prevents the big. So that's one way I think that we can address shame and fear. So it might be in the sense of, what can you do as parents? How can you make your kids feel more accepted, or like they don't have to be ashamed of their identity or who they are? Or what can we do as teachers or leaders or politicians? Those small things that help prevent the big issues of shame and fear that lead to this sense of authenticity, because earlier we saw what lower authenticity brings. So I say that another way to lessen the weight and risk for others, yourself, or by finding or for others, is by finding your noble purpose. So noble purpose is a pretty cool concept. It's by William Damon. He's a Stanford professor. And I think that finding your noble purpose will reduce shame and fear, not only just for yourself, but for others in the environments that we create as people. Now, is this going to reduce shame and fear overnight? Absolutely not. It took us many years to get here, and it will take us many years to get back. Um, and so, finding your noble purpose is a way that we can create our more authentic selves. So, in his book, he highlights 5 key points of how you can find your noble purpose. So, he says the first one being noble versus heroic. So, when we think of noble, we think of mythical heroes fighting mythical dragons. So we think of these we think of these huge, bold, courageous, but events, these grand adventures and gestures. But heroic can be found not just in those huge events. Heroic can be very mundane. So it could be a mother raising a single child. It could be advocating for a candidate. It could be just making a smaller contribution to your world, whether it's a small thing. It doesn't have to be this grand adventure. So think about that. He says formula. So he gives a formula for noble purpose, which I think is super cool. So he says, this is a Venn diagram here. So you take your skills, and if you can see, this is a Venn diagram. You take your skills, you take what you love to do, and you take what the world needs. And when you mix those together, it helps you live your noble purpose and brings you to being authentic and finding joy. So, for example, if I were to take my skills, so I'm pretty good at connecting people. I love having conversation and learning. What the world needs now, well, we're going through coronavirus. A lot of people are feeling isolated. So maybe the world needs now is some more people to reach out and check on each other. And when we put all 3 of those together, that's what leads to our most authentic self and brings us joy. So the formula. And it's a pretty good formula. Try it. Try it today. It's pretty easy. It's not like we have anything to do. We're staying home, right? He says, number 3 is exemplars. So if you want to stay true to your noble purpose, find someone that models what you want to be or do. Look at people who embody what you inspire. Moral exemplars. So find a community that supports you or that will engage in your pursuit of your noble purpose. Because they will support you as you make that journey and lift you up. He says the 4th thing that leads us to finding our noble purpose is humility. So, 1 second while I check on the Zoom people, make sure they're okay. All right, they're doing okay. All right, so what he says in humility is sic transit gloria. Anybody know what sic transit gloria is? So, back in Rome, you had emperors, and they were at the height of power. So nobody is more powerful than emperors. And the emperor would go around in his chariot while the crowd was cheering, like, oh yeah, there's the emperor. He can do no wrong. He's powerful. And in that chariot, there was always an advisor. So even the emperor had an advisor. And in the heat of the moment, when everybody is cheering, the advisor would lean over and he would whisper into the emperor's ear, sic transit gloria. And what that means is all glory is fleeting, meaning not to take yourself so seriously. You must have humility. Without humility, we're unable to see what is working and what is not working, and we're unable to do something about it. And the fifth thing he says is happiness. So he states that happiness, the people who go after happiness directly often have happiness the least. And this makes so much sense. Think about the people that are trying to get their beach body or that want to be famous. Happiness does not exist in those things. We think it does. We think it'll exist in those things. But happiness, it happens by giving yourself to something bigger than yourself. You do not pursue happiness. Happiness is a byproduct of living a meaningful life. So, I mean, and this also references back to what Brene Brown was saying. She says those that are not living authentic lives are often empty inside. And they seek intensity, remember? Which are those things like that they do to feel alive, like drugs, sex, overspending, eating, focusing on being successful and looking great. So those are the things that Brene Brown says that, are inside us that don't lead us to authenticity. So what does this mean? Okay, so we talked about shame and fear. Let's recap. We talked about shame and fear. We learned the 4 components of shame and fear in the study. We learned that Brene Brown says that in order to be more authentic and be ourselves and not be ashamed of who we are, fearful of rejection, the path to that is vulnerability. But in looking at that path to vulnerability, we dissected the weight of vulnerability. So the weight of vulnerability for people that identify, in this case, as LGBTQ plus, is pretty heavy. It's the loss of job, of services, of family, of rights. So when we think about it in that sense, what can we do to lessen that weight of vulnerability? So we talked today about, using broken windows theory to address those small things. We talked about taking your noble purpose and using it to lessen shame and fear in others and create a sense of authenticity and happiness. So how do we create our noble purpose? To do that, much like he said, and I didn't write down the last one, happiness. So, much like he said, noble versus heroic. So, you can do this. Maybe it's changing your email signature to include your preferred pronouns. Maybe it's writing a legislator about a legislation that affects minorities or recovering addicts or ex-offenders. You don't have to do something heroic, noble, to be a hero. It's in the small things. Like William Damon says, it's a single mother raising her children. It's fighting for a cause. We see with these mutual aid groups as a result of the coronavirus, it might be just being checking on your neighbor. So it's the small things. All things that you can do. He also says the formula. So take what you love, what you're good at, and what the world needs. You will find yourself creating more authentic workspaces and places. So is finding your noble purpose going to change everything overnight? No, but when you employ these concepts that Damon is talking about, it helps create those authentic spaces. So the third one being exemplars, what we talked about. So finding a like-minded community where you share the same values, where you can see if they can do it, I can do it. So maybe it's an LGBT group where you feel comfortable. Maybe it's a recovering addict group where you feel comfortable. Maybe it's a group of young professionals. I had that in Pittsburgh. We were called the Positive Deviants. Positive Deviants is actually a theory where you focus on what is working instead of what is not. It's a way of looking at the world. So find that group that lifts you up. Humility, sic transit gloria. Don't sit back and say, well, this does not affect me, or I don't care, or I'm just power, I'm immune to this, look at me. Because, I mean, this is a prime example. It could be you someday. Yeah, we're in the midst of the coronavirus scare. Maybe you're young, you don't have any immune issues, it doesn't affect you, but it does affect people that you might care about, other people out in the world. So don't take yourself too seriously. Don't let that power come to your head. Sic transit gloria. And lastly, happiness. So it's not something you pursue. Yeah, it's a byproduct. So maybe some of you have the positional power to be bigger. Your leaders, your managers, your politicians, your authors, etc. You can be an exemplar for how to change a place of shame and fear using small things. You have the power to create an authentic environment by employing your noble purpose, by creating something bigger than yourself, like we talked about in happiness, because happiness is not directly pursuing something. It is creating something that is bigger than yourself. So maybe it's instilling gender neutral language in an employee handbook. Maybe it's establishing a non-discrimination policy. Maybe it's introducing legislation for banning unethical treatment to minorities, or for those who might be seen less than. Maybe it's just asking your coworker how their wife or partner is, or what their preferred pronoun is. So this is how some ways that we can take our noble purpose and we can use it to minimize shame and fear in our workplaces, in our homes, in our communities. So to recap, together we have to find ways that lessen the weight of risk and vulnerability that we talked about. Because for many populations that are less than norm, and for the LGBT population, that weight is just too heavy. So we can start with these small things. Maybe nationally we can't change the world, but we can start with the small things. Kim says she loves my bow tie shirt. So we can start with those small things that we do have the ability to change, much like William Damon says. It doesn't have to be noble. We can do the mundane stuff that really creates environments that are authentic. So think about how you can do that as you come into your roles as friends, coworkers, leaders, politicians, social workers, advocates, parents, etc. So I shared some of my ideas about how that can be done here today, from the broken windows theory to finding your noble purpose. Nothing is immediate. It took hundreds of years for us to get here. It's going to take hundreds of years for us to get unstuck. So today, maybe make a Venn diagram like I did. Create a formula of what you are good at, what the world needs, what you love to do, and follow it. And that helps lead you to your noble purpose, which affects everybody, in creating spaces that decrease shame and fear. So thank you guys for coming today. I'm going to wait a couple minutes and see if anybody has any questions or comments or criticisms or jokes. I don't see any questions yet. I appreciate people jumping on from different time zones and countries here. Let me make sure I'm not missing any comments via Facebook. Mark says my bow tie is banging. I tried. Oh, not only is there a bow tie, I have a pen, a pencil, a red pen, and a pocket protector, and these glasses. And then I wore a sweater over top of it. This is an Amazon purchase. And I'm in my bare feet and some socks. Thank you, Jim, for coming. So many different people here today. New people, my students, old bosses, friends, grade school teachers, people I've never met. Awesome. All right, so I intend to hear about um, uh, how this is sitting with you all. And let me know if you have any questions. Linda says, I'm glad you're living your authentic life and living your noble purpose. Thanks for inviting me. Abel says, super interesting. Thank you. I appreciate you guys all hanging out. I'll make sure I got everybody's questions. Cool. Cool. Thank you, Kim. Well, I think that's pretty much it. If you want a cool book to read, check out Noble Purpose by William Damon, and try taking those 5 things today and figuring out how you can put them to work. All right. Thank you guys. Take care.